we look at what's going on with Fox, and to a certain degree, you have to wonder, who's next? So, having been thinking more about what's going on with Fox and the acquisition going on by Disney, and I'll say what I've said the last few times I've brought it up, even though there is no reason that won't go through so far as we can tell, even if that does fall through, Fox is selling off its television and film production. It's doing that regardless. They were having a sale. Disney is currently looking to be the one who's going to buy. But in many ways, anyone who's been watching the industry for a while this was a surprise, because it really did seem like if anybody was going to do this, it was going to be Sony. Because Sony, first of all, has not actually been in film production for that long. Sony acquired Columbia Pictures in '89, and it's not even 30 years they've been at this. I mean, you want to compare that to something like Warner Brothers or Disney or Universal or even Fox, they're not even close. They have not been at this for all that long. And their successes have been kind of up and down. That's not necessarily atypical, but you look at the last few years, it's been rough for Sony. Now, recently they did kind of reiterate going, no, we're not selling our film division. We're gonna keep on powering on. I have to imagine that's probationary, though. I really would have to think that the current heads of Sony Pictures are being watched very carefully by the heads of Sony as an overall corporation, because there are plenty of other divisions of Sony that are doing fine. Electronics, video games, they've got other areas they are doing just fine, and I think in many ways right now the film division is a brick around the neck of this company as a whole, and if it doesn't start pulling its own weight, I think they are going to cut it loose. But let me give a little context, because I had felt this, and I don't do research usually, but I really wanted to see if I could back up this gut feeling that I had that there's a really good chance that Sony could start selling off these assets in the next, let's say, 5 years. So I looked at, again, 5 years is a good benchmark, the last 5 years worth of box office numbers for Sony. Now, 2012 was a good year for them. It was actually their biggest year ever. That was the year that they had things like Skyfall, The Amazing Spider-Man, Men in Black 3, Hotel Transylvania, 21 Jump Street. That was a good year for Sony, and they've been doing okay leading up to that. 2013 was the first big drop, down 34%. Now, to a certain degree, you could chalk that up to, well, we can't get sequels out to the big sort of franchise starters we got going last year. We got to deal with some other stuff. They had their hits, they had their misses, they had kind of their break-evens. That was kind of how I broke stuff out. Now, and when I use the term break-even, or even when I say hits or misses, I need to define these terms a little bit, because trying to actually figure out what is a hit and what is a flop is actually almost impossible, because we don't actually know how much gets spent on these movies. We know what the officially listed production budget is, but that's not the full cost of the movie. Depending on how long it's been in production, there are often development costs, if it's been stalled multiple times, that are a factor but don't get listed in the production budget. Most of these don't account for marketing, which can be anywhere from half to double the production budget in some cases. So there's all that. We don't know how much these things cost in the first place. But the hard and fast rule, and I do mean hard and fast, sometimes this rule is not enough to get you there, but it's the rule of thumb that I'm using is, if a film can double its production budget, then it has broken even. So any film that I mention going forward on these, if I say that it flopped, it fell notably short of doubling its production budget. If I say it broke even, it doubled its production budget within several million of that, within ballpark. If it did notably more than double its production budget, that's a hit. Again, I don't want to debate the specifics, because honestly, we could have an argument over every single one of these that I'm going to bring out. But that's just the general metric, and And this is more about the patterns and not the specific box office takes of any individual film I talk about. So please bear with me on that. As I said, 2013, there was a drop, but it was also a bit of a mixed result. And sort of a recurring thing I'm going to keep coming back to, and I think what Sony's big problem is right now is they don't have a stable franchise. And they keep trying to get one going, and it's not working out. Now, some of the things that they tried to get or even had as franchises for a little while that kind of had issues, you're going to see some of them here. So, like, some of the flops of 2013 included White House Down, After Earth, Mortal Instruments, City of Bones. Bet you didn't even remember that was a thing that happened. And then Carrie, which was a big budget horror remake, should have been a sure thing. That only broke even. Elysium, which was Neil Blomkamp's big follow-up to District 9. District 9 had been nominated for an Oscar. That only broke even. But they did still have some promise. Smurfs 2 got eviscerated by critics, but that was a hit. That made decent money. Their Evil Dead remake actually made good money. This Is the End, Captain Phillips, Collided with a Chance of Meatballs 2. Grown Ups 2, American Hustle, all those were solid. But the thing is, though, really none of those were mega hits. They were profitable, but none of them really on the scale that Sony probably wanted. Certainly not on the scale of the stuff they saw in 2012, which actually I think if they'd had more of an eye for some mid-budget franchising, they would have, maybe made a sequel to their Evil Dead remake, which, as I said, actually made decent money. But unfortunately, and this isn't unique to Sony, the studios, a lot of them, seem to have adopted this, we are in the tentpole business. We are not interested in mid-budget, decent profits, lower risk things. They are going all in. They want the maximum return, which first of all means spending more money on these projects in the first place, which makes them more important to be hits each and every time. But in addition to that, by eliminating a lot of these mid tiers, that the approach that they've adopted is they look at something like Evil Dead, which again, decent hit, made just shy of $100 million on a $17 million budget, really profitable. But the thing is, just shy of $100 million box office doesn't look impressive. Not when you're looking at what Disney and Warner Brothers are putting up in the hundreds of millions of dollars, $400 million plus, or even Sony's own previous year before. They look at shy of $100 million and they go, well, that wasn't what we wanted. It's not taking into account the fact that they only spent $17 million on it. So that was a tidy profit. And yet, somehow, we didn't get an Evil Dead sequel. Now, 2014 saw a very slight uptick. Their total grosses were up about 7% from 2013, but still down 29% from 2012. And there were some decent hits in here, ranging from tentpoles to smaller stuff. On the high end, they had The Amazing Spider-Man 2, which honestly underperformed for what they thought it was gonna do, but still did turn a decent profit. At least we think it did. Again, we don't know what they actually spent on it. But there was 22 Jump Street, The Equalizer, Heaven is for Real, Think Like a Man 2, Whiplash, but then we get into the evens and the flops and we start seeing more franchise non-starters. RoboCop, they basically broke even on. Annie, which maybe wasn't going to be a franchise starter, but what was their big go at a family musical? That only broke even. Pompeii, their big disaster epic, that was a flop. Even their Oscar push, Foxcatcher, they spent $24 million and made $12. 2015, we are down another 21%. Now, 2015 was another decent but not great year. They still didn't even come close to doing what they did in 2012. But this was a year that saw some of their major franchises have their actual established successful franchises have new entries. So there was Spectre, Hotel Transylvania 2, Paul Blart Mall Cop 2, Pixels, not technically a sequel, but Sony was garnering a decent relationship with Adam Sandler, and those movies were profitable. But even these, something wasn't quite right. You want to take a look at Spectre, which was their biggest grosser that year, and it did very well, but they spent $45 million more on it than they spent on Skyfall and made $200 million less with it than they made with Skyfall. They spent more to make less. Then Neil Blomkamp only managed to break even again with Chappie, and we get two more flops of what were intended to be awards contenders with Concussion and Aloha. So right now the pattern that's emerging is Sony is just not having any luck with their awards chasing stuff. They're starting to already abandon their mid-tier stuff that isn't already somehow franchise material. And I would lump Happy Madison Productions in with those, even though like it's not like all Adam Sandler produced films are in a continuity with each other, but that's a pretty standard product. You're franchised off of the brand and the vibe of what he does. Then we get to the real low point. 2016. 2016 drops another 8%. This is down about 50% from 2012. This was their first year where they failed to make $1 billion in box office receipts since 2005, and it was their lowest overall year since 2001. This was the year of Ghostbusters, the Magnificent Seven remake, which they spent way too much money on, the Brothers Grimsby, Pride and Prejudice and Zombies, another young adult non-starter with The Fifth Wave. And even their hits weren't that big a hit. Their biggest moneymaker that year, Angry Birds and Passengers, and not even really, because that thing was stuck in production development hell for so long that the $100 million they say they spent on the official budget, I guarantee you that doesn't take into account how much money they spent on false starts for this thing. You know, you had a couple of things in there. You had Don't Breathe, you had Sausage Party, but they had no major smash hits in 2016, and they had multiple things that were supposed to be and were intended to be and were supposed to start franchises and didn't. 2017, last year, things got slightly better. Up about 15% from 2016, but still down about 40% versus 2012. The big surprise hit, Jumanji: Welcome to the Jungle, which made huge money off of a reasonably contained budget. Spider-Man: Homecoming, Baby Driver, Resident Evil: The Final Chapter, yeah, that was profitable. The Emoji Movie, believe it or not. But they also had a fair number of missteps and some pretty public ones with things like All the Money in the World, the Flatlanders remake, Rough Night, and again, some franchise non-starters or some franchise should have been continuing to live off of what had come before and they kind of didn't. And that's where you find The Dark Tower, Underworld Blood Wars, Smurfs: The Lost Village, which was actually profitable, but made almost 50% less than the previous Smurfs movie, down both domestic and foreign. So what it seems like Sony is dealing with right now is they are in desperate need for at least 3 stable, profitable franchises. And that word stable is a big thing, because the few franchises that they have that are reliable to semi-reliable are just not consistent. Spider-Man, they've seen that blow up on them already. They had to get Marvel in to come and help that. And again, Amazing Spider-Man 2 was profitable, but it was nowhere near what they were predicting it to be, and it was not stable enough to launch all the stuff that they wanted to launch off of that. Now, they're kind of doing what they did before. They are expecting to be able to branch things off of it. We've got the Venom movie coming out. They're dipping their toes a little more. They were planning a heck of a lot more off the back of Amazing Spider-Man 2. They seem to be taking it slightly more one project at a time here, but they're still trying to find ways to milk more out of Spider-Man. Like I said, they had a decent thing going with Adam Sandler, but he's now moved on to Netflix, so they lost that. Hotel Transylvania might currently be their most stable franchise, but honestly, the third one looks kind of painful, and I don't know how much longer they'll be able to milk that. One presumes we'll probably get an Angry Birds sequel. We'll see what they can do with that. They have Men in Black. They haven't figured out what to do with it since the third one. One would think James Bond could bring some stability, but there's 2 problems with that. The first thing is that they actually don't control it completely. It's partly with MGM. They're partnered on that, which means they don't see all the money from those things anyways. And the other thing is the production cycle of those things is way longer than it should be for a major tentpole franchise at this point. The thing is, you look at something like Marvel or even DC, which has been, they've been a mess with Warner Brothers and the DCEU, but they crank these things out at least one a year, if not 2 or 3. And that's what you get from these big stable franchises. Star Wars, we've been getting 1 a year, and all these things. James Bond, we've been looking at 4-year gaps between them, with labored productions. The way that these things seem to be made is just in a very older mentality. It's not a well-oiled machine. It's not reliable. There's some stuff that hasn't completely bombed for them yet, but it probably doesn't have much gas left in the tank, and that's your Resident Evils, your Underworlds, your Smurfs. But right now, Sony has a graveyard of failed franchise starters. Ghostbusters, The Dark Tower, The Fifth Wave, RoboCop, Evil Dead, Mortal Instruments. And again, some of these even could have been launched into something, but for whatever reason, Sony didn't move on the few that could have made it, and most of these flat out bombed. You look at the other major studios right now, and what they have going for them is sustainable franchises. Several. The ones that are healthiest right now, obviously Disney. Disney's got a cavalcade of the things. They've got Marvel, they've got Star Wars, they've got Disney Animation, they've got Pixar. Over at Warner Brothers, they've got all the Harry Potter related stuff, the DCEU, the Lego branded movies, their kaiju verse they're doing with the King Kong and Godzilla thing, and their little Conjuring universe, which is not setting the box office on fire the way some of this other stuff is, but turning a nice little profit. Even Universal, which might be in a similar boat to Sony, at least has two mega reliable franchises, the Despicable Me franchise and Fast and the Furious. Those, Universal could use more, and obviously they've got problems too. Their whole dark universe collapsed, and I might have to talk about Universal in a separate video at some point in the future. I don't know about that. But in any case, they've at least got those two. And actually, I would go beyond just Despicable Me. Illumination Entertainment has been massively reliable for Universal, even outside of Despicable Me specifically. All their films have turned a solid profit. Sing, Secret Life of Pets. So they've got a stable, they've got a specific franchise as well as a stable relationship with their animation department. Sony Animation has been up and down. Plus, Universal has Fast and the Furious, which they're now looking into spin-offs for. They're in a better place franchise-wise than Sony is. Sony has Spider-Man, which they are in constant fear of losing, because if they don't keep cranking out films, Marvel gets the rights back, but them having to crank these things out at such a pace increases the chances that they don't work. It's feasible that maybe they could get something out of Jumanji. Like I said, that was a real big surprise hit last year, but there's also a distinct chance that it was a fluke. The one runaway hit does not necessarily translate to a franchise. And I mean, how would you franchise it? Would you have it be a completely different set of players and characters and setting every single time so that it's almost like a Jumanji anthology kind of thing? Or would you actually try and do a direct sequel? I haven't seen Jumanji Welcome to the Jungle, so I don't know what the better call is, but that seems like a bit of a stretch. The thing is, though, if Sony doesn't net, Sony needs two things to happen. They need to net another two stable, reliable, every 2 or 3 year they get a new installment franchises. They need those, and they need to have less high profile flops, because that is the thing. You don't necessarily have to have everything make a ton of money as long as there isn't other stuff dragging you down. You either minimize your losses or you increase your profits, ideally both. And Sony really right now needs both. And like I said, Sony is a company that could sell off its film division. They were a big enough, they bought their way into this game in the first place. They didn't build a studio from the ground up. They bought Columbia. And I said maybe do something about Universal. The thing is, though, Universal is an entertainment company. That is what they are. So if they get rid of that, they just go away. Sony is a lot more than just making movies. So they could look at what Fox is doing, and if this ultimately works out well for Fox in terms of what their goal is, streamlining to the things that they believe that they dominate in, as opposed to trying to continue to play a blockbuster game against companies that they made the determination that they can't ever beat, like Warner Brothers, like Disney. They're like, you know what, we're not even going to play that game anymore. I bet you Sony is really looking at them and will be assessing over the next few years whether or not that's a good call for them to make. I think the only thing that might save it beyond just getting stable franchises is if they can increase synergy across their divisions, because right now, for all the film that they make and the fact that they have the PlayStation as a brand and then they have their own video game production studios, there's not a lot of synergized crossover there. Like the Spider-Man games that have been related to the movies have been farmed out crap. It just seems like a real chance for those divisions to build on top of each other that they're not doing. And so maybe there just should be more integration. If something like that happens, maybe they could feel like it's buoying their other divisions and it's worth keeping around. But like I said, right now, unless there's a major shift, unless Sony can... Well, here's what I would say. Unless they successfully launch a series of Spider-Man spin-offs that can sustain as their own franchises, or they manage to launch a completely new franchise property, or 2 or 3, I don't see Sony still being in this game within 5 years, within 3 even, possibly. I say give it, once the Fox acquisition is finalized and everything transfers over to Disney, 2 years after that, Sony will make its call as to whether or not it's getting out of this game. And if things haven't picked up, gotten noticeably better, gotten back up to around where things were in 2012 by then, they're going to get out of this game. At least that's what I think is probably going to happen. So those are my thoughts and my overly long and detailed explanation. God, I threw a lot of numbers. See, this is why I don't do research. I look up these numbers and I'm like, I need to say the numbers because I went to the trouble to looking them up. I'm not sure how much I actually needed to get into specifics to the degree that I did. I don't even know if anybody cares. In any case, what are your thoughts on all this? Whatever they are, drop something down in the comments. Let's talk about it. There's all the stuff to do with likes and subscribes and Patreon support and buy a t-shirt and follow me on Twitter. Listen to my podcast. Links for all this stuff is down in the description. So until next time, this council is adjourned.